In Live on Live this afternoon, I'm joined in the studio by writer, polemicist and celebrated apostate Ibn Warraq, who penned Why I'm Not a Muslim back in the 1990s and released his latest book, The Islam in Islamic Terrorism, in March, that aims to pick apart modern misconceptions regarding what lies at the root of the modern-day jihad. Ibn Warraq, you're very welcome to the programme.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Now, let's have a look at your latest book. This book aims to dispel the argument that present-day Islamic terrorism is a socio-economic phenomenon, but rather a meticulously planned campaign being waged by affluent Muslims. Now, indeed, following the money trail to who is funding terrorism brings investigators back to various Gulf states, but can it not be argued that those who are being recruited from Jakarta to Brussels come from a disillusioned lower socio-economic background?
Well, that's not the case. If you look at the sociological studies done by people like Saad ad-Din Ibrahim in Egypt in the 1970s, late 1970s, he looked at two particular groups of jihadists, and he discovered that they were from middle-class families, well off, and quite well educated. They had no need to indulge in violence for.
But this was back in the day, let's say, before social media, which has now become a real point for recruitment at the moment in modern day 2017. What parallels can be made between what happened in the 70s and what's happening now today?
You must look at the driving, motivating forces behind certainly the leaders, and the common man. The common recruit to the jihadist cause may well be from various different backgrounds, but the overriding motivating strategy behind all this is manipulated, if you like, if certainly controlled by well-educated jihadists who are well-versed in Islamic theology. I mean, Al-Azam, for example, one of the leaders in the jihadist movement, had a doctorate in Sharia. So it's no good pretending that these people were ignorant of Islamic theology.
Well, I mean, I suppose we can say the same could be said for al-Baghdadi today with Islamic State. These people are very well versed in Islam itself. But you also point to in your book that the word jihad itself is deeply rooted in the texts of Islam and not just a few passages that have been misinterpreted, say, by zealots. So does this mean, in your opinion, that all Muslims are bound by the Quran to accept holy war as part of their doctrine?
If they follow it literally, indeed, you have to be a good Muslim. You have to obey the Quran, which is the literal word of God, and it is a religious incumbent duty for all Muslims to carry out jihad until Islam covers the entire globe.
Mm-hmm. Now, today, well, sorry to cut you off, but today, of course, marks the 16th anniversary of the September 11th attacks on New York and Washington. Now, in the wake of those attacks, pundits and analysts pointed the finger at US foreign policy being the motivating reason or the motivation to strike American soil. But you, however, disagree.
Indeed, it has very little to do with American foreign policy. If anything, American foreign policy in the Middle East has been one of conciliation. They've had a conciliatory approach. I mean, it was Eisenhower who told the Europeans to knock it off when they were trying to plan an invasion of Suez in 1956. The amount of aid that the Americans have given to the Middle Eastern countries, they've always taken a pro-Islamic stance. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
And billions, of course, being thrown at the likes of Saudi Arabia to keep them on side.
Absolutely.
However, we can't deny that there has been a perfect storm over the past century that has created this violent strain of Islam. Be it, I mean, on one side you could say it's political with the rise of Wahhabism, or intellectual, should I say, with the rise of Wahhabism, but then political in recent decades with Western intervention, specifically American intervention, in the places like Iraq or wherever it may be in the Middle East, Afghanistan.
Yes, but that you mentioned Wahhab. That is completely 18th century. He wasn't even aware of any European encroachment on Islamic territory. He was writing in the middle of the 18th century. What he wanted was to reassert Islamic identity. He wanted to get rid of the innovations that had been introduced in Arabic bid'ah.
So he was a revivalist.
Exactly. He was a revivalist who wanted to return to the pristine condition of Islam in the early days of the Prophet and the companions and so on.
Now, also in your book, you like to dispel the fact that, let's say a lot of Western analysts or pundits tend to look towards Sufism as being kind of a peaceful version of Islam, but you try to denigrate that 100%. Why?
Well, you just have to look at the history of the Sufi movement in Persia, in India. The Sufis were 100% behind for example, in India, the various Sufis like Waliullah were behind very much in support of the various measures by various Mughal emperors to introduce more and more Islam, even though the majority of the people were not Muslims. But they were completely in accord with that.
But what about, let's look to the Islamic Golden Age. Now, you mentioned the Mughals. Let's say we can, I suppose, say that the Islamic Golden Age of the early medieval period, the 13th century thereabouts, from the 8th to the 13th, or maybe even further on, depending on who you wish to study, did that come to an end with the Mughals or the Mongols when they arrived? And were they also a factor, if you will, in how would you say, making Islam more violent as maybe as a form of defense?
No. The Mughals, this is the term used for the various dynasties in India, starting with Babur in the 16th century. They were, in fact, they culminating in the very tolerant policies of Akbar the Great, who was a rough contemporary of Elizabeth the First in England. He didn't even consider himself a Muslim. He was a very, very tolerant man. He tried to restore the temples that had been destroyed, the Hindu temples. He wanted to encourage interreligious dialogue and so on. So, but outside India, the Golden Age is thought to be the ages when philosophers like Ibn Rushd of Averroes, Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the West, but that's really the 13th century, much earlier.
Now let's have a look. I mean, we're looking back into the past. Even if we can follow, let's say, the root cause of Islamic terrorism all the way back to the 7th or 8th centuries, and the series, as we mentioned earlier, the revivalist movements since then that have sought to return Islam to its original and pure state. What can be done to stop the latest attempts to set up an Islamic state or a caliphate?
What can be done?
Can't be done today.
There are two aspects. There's the military aspect. We should defeat the army of Daesh and ISIS and so on, and that should be easy. But we don't seem to have the will or the.
Well, it's kind of throwing a rock at a hornet's nest, because even if we get them, or even if the military gets them out of Iraq or Syria, they'll now just go into cyberspace and they'll pop up everywhere else around the world.
And,
so
and
what's the next?
Indeed, they will be replaced. I mean, I think Al Qaeda is already moving in where ISIS has been thrown out. So my underlying point in the book is that we cannot win simply on the military level, although even then that would have an enormous impact.
So what's the other level?
The other level is the war of ideas. We need to pursue the kind of policies that won us the Cold War in the 50s and so on. But we've lost, in the West, we've lost civilizational confidence.
On that note, I mean, here in France, for example, this country has been trying to grapple with the idea of Islam de France to reconcile, let's say, the deeply secular Fifth Republic in which we live here with the teachings of the Quran. Do you think France is delusional in trying to do so, or is there actually something to that?
It is delusional, but we need to work with moderate Muslims. Islam itself is not moderate, but there are moderate Muslims. So there's this distinction that also in historically speaking, in the past, Islamic history has not been a relentless series of theocratic dictatorships. It varied according to the period and the ruler in place. They did tend to separate state from religion, and that seems to me to be the answer: the separation of state and religion. We cannot really reconcile the strict tenets of Islam with democracy, but we can persuade Muslims that it is the interest of everyone to have a separation of religion and state, where they are guaranteed freedom of religion. They're free to practice their religion as long as they do not try to force it upon others. And in fact, you mentioned this, excuse me if I don't want to offend you, but this cliche of the fastest growing religion. I looked into this, and in fact, it really isn't the case. The number of apostates is growing by an amazing number in the Islamic countries. So we have several million people who are leaving Islam. So and also those who supposedly convert to Islam, if you really follow them up, you'll find that about 75 to 80% of them just they leave it after that. They don't continue to practice it in any meaningful way.
They're being dilettantes. They're checking it out, and then they're leaving on it. They're balancing each other out.
Absolutely.
Now, finally, just one question: people who have read your book, I mean, I saw that you've edited it down from 160,000 words down to a third of that. So, I mean, you've obviously done your research, and there have been criticisms of what your stance is about Islam. How do you respond to people who call you an Islamophobe?
This is a way to shut down any criticism of Islam. On the contrary, we need to examine all the tenets of Islam in the way that we've examined at least, I mean, in fact, it goes back to earlier, at least since the 17th century with Spinoza's wonderful Tractatus. And it was Spinoza who was responsible for launching, according to certainly the 3-volume magnificent works of Jonathan Israel. It was Spinoza who launched the European Enlightenment with his criticism of religion, of Christianity, of course. And the ironical thing is that Spinoza may well have been influenced by one or two Muslim philosophers.
Indeed, at the time. Well, I mean, yet again, the Enlightenment was a painful birth. So, I mean, we also have a painful future ahead.
Indeed.
Okay, Ibn Warraq, author of The Islam in Islamic Terrorism. Thank you very much for being on the program today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.